This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, promoting humanistic, democratic and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. I'm your host, Gilad Halpern.
And I'm your co-hostess, Dahlia Shenlin. Every week we talk to authors about their books and research and things that we find fascinating and that have caught our attention. As always, you can support us by going to tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review and clicking on the Patreon button to support us, or go to patreon.com/Tel Aviv Review. However you get to us, please give. A little goes a long way. Our guest today is Orly Noy. She is an editor at the independent Hebrew website Local Call, a political activist, and a translator of Farsi poetry and prose. She is a member of B'Tselem's executive board and an activist with the Balad political party. She's translated 5 books, 3 novels, 1 book of poetry, and another one on the way, which maybe you'll tell us about. And we'll be focusing on her most recent book, a collection of Persian language poetry called These Are Strange Times, Pretty One, published by Katav Web Publishing in 2017. And we will also maybe talk a little bit about The Colonel, published by Chaugol Books in 2012, which is a novel. And we should also note that 2 of her prose translations, My Uncle Napoleon and The Colonel, have also been translated into English. Orly Noy, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Hi, good to be here.
We don't have too many translators on the show, and you are a translator with a mission. Can you explain why you've worked so hard to translate so much of modern Persian literature into Hebrew?
I'll tell you how I got into that business of translations. Years ago, I was searching on Google. I don't remember exactly even why I was searching, but I typed the words Farsi literature into Google, and Google replied, "Did you mean Russian literature?" Which I thought was
that in Hebrew or in English?
That was in Hebrew, and I thought, well, Google doesn't have a sense of humor. He's not joking. He just really honestly doesn't know the concept of Farsi literature.
Maybe if Google was a she would have a better time.
That is a good... But then I thought that it's truly an absurd that a culture of thousands of years, which is for me the cradle of at least Eastern civilization, has almost no representation in the Hebrew language, certainly not a contemporary Farsi literature. So I thought somebody should start doing that, and I did.
Clearly, I mean, it has, political ramifications. And the reason that was such scarcity was political. So in adapting the, body of Iranian Persian literature in Hebrew, in selecting those, even in the process of translation, were there any, key elements that you thought were particularly relevant for a Hebrew reader?
This was really, since it was a political mission for me since the beginning, because I think that it is a political reality, or it's a reflection of a political reality and the marginalization of Muslim and Arab culture in Iran. In Israel, the choosing and being the first translator of contemporary Farsi literature into Hebrew, there was a significant question of, so what do I start with? Do I start with the classics? Do I start with poetry? Do I start with prose? What sort of prose? And my process of choosing was directed by my identity both as Iranian and as an Israeli. As an Iranian, I thought that the best, it was a question of quality. I mean, I wanted the best literature to be translated into Hebrew. As an Israeli, I wanted very much things that in some sort would be relevant to the Israeli reader. So the combination of these 2 guidelines sort of dictated
Since you raised that you have, an Iranian part of your identity, maybe explain a little bit, how do you know Farsi so well? What is your Iranian background?
I was born and raised in Iran. We immigrated to Israel at the very beginning of the revolution in 1979. I was 9 at the time. But I grew up in a very proud national Iranian family. My parents made sure that my brother and I read Farsi throughout the years. So I maintained not only a good level of Farsi, but also a very, very solid Iranian identity.
How did your family end up in Israel and not in Los Angeles like the rest of them?
Or Vancouver?
You know, sometimes people tend to reconstruct retroactively their life stories. So today, if you ask my parents, they will tell you, of course, we were always good Zionists and we always knew that we would end up in Israel. I'm sure that had it not been for the revolution, we would never have ended up here. But we had some family at the time in Israel already, and it just made more sense, and I'm really glad that was the choice of my parents and not LA.
Well, as you point out, there is a Persian Jewish community in Israel. Why was it that all of that time there was no translation of Farsi language literature into Hebrew? I mean, for you to be the first, and I think your first two novels were both published in 2012, that's a long history of Israel without any Persian literature. How do you explain that? I mean, was it conscious political suppression, or just nobody got around to it?
And we've got to bear in mind that it was, Israel and Iran became fierce enemies only in the late 1970s.
Yes.
So it's even before that, when the so-called golden age of Israeli-Iranian relations, there was no translation whatsoever.
Well, when you put it that way, it certainly sounds astonishing. But when you bear in mind that it's not only, there is not such a small Iranian community in Israel, but if you bear in mind that almost half of the Jewish population in Israel are from Arab origin, and how many translations from Arabic prose into Hebrew do you know of? So it's not so surprising. And it's within the broader context, the political context of suppressing any link to the culture and the identity of the origin countries, the Muslim and Arab countries. That was part of the inexplicit deal that Zionism made with the Mizrahi communities in Israel, that you can come inside, but then you will need to work very, very hard to prove to us that you're not one of them because you look like them and you share their language and historic memory and culture, etc. So that became the Mizrahi project, to suppress their native identity and culture, and that's the result.
But then they get the image in Israel of having no culture and being primitive.
Exactly.
That's quite a catch-22.
Okay, let's shift the focus from Israel to Iran. And in the introduction to These Are Strange Times, you write that out of all the arts, poetry has been the most influential in shaping modern Iranian identity. Can you explain how?
Not just, Iran is, and now I will speak as an Iranian nationalist, and you'll forgive me for
our
that.
listeners. She's putting on her other hat right now as we speak.
But, Iran is a country that really, truly breathes culture. It's always been about culture. And that, by the way, this is why Iranians have an identity that does not depend on any current regime. Regimes come and go throughout the very long history of Iran, but the Iranian identity is based on its culture primarily. And of all the cultures, and Iran is a master in all of them, but poetry is the jewel of the crown. It's if you go to the remotest village in Iran and you speak with a complete analphabet who cannot read or write, he will cite by heart hundreds of lines from the classical Iranian poets. So this is the manifestation of the Iranian identity more than anything.
So it's an oral and a written tradition.
Yeah, absolutely.
In the introduction, you note that many of the poets, especially the ones you chose, I don't know if you focus particularly on these, but many of the poets over the years have been banned or imprisoned. Mm-hmm. Some cultural figures have paid with their lives. I guess we'll talk about them, but from Ahmed Shamlou to Farrokhzad, you'll tell us if I'm pronouncing them correctly. Well, I guess I have a couple of questions, but I'll start with one. Do you think that living under repressive regimes, whichever one it is, somehow gives rise to a particular focus on, great culture and the need for this outpouring because there's such heavy political repression? Or is it the opposite? Does that kind of political repression and very oppressive regimes stifle culture? Could it have been more if there were more permissive regimes?
Well, that's a great question. I didn't think about it that way. I mean, I wouldn't want to think that political oppression is needed in order to create great art in general or literature, because it says something very, very sad about human nature. But I think it's true mainly, and you can see even more in the Iranian cinema, which really became magnificent after. I mean, there was some really good cinema even before the revolution. But after the revolution, one of the things that happened was that since they were not allowed to show love stories, intimacy, exposed women, etc., then they needed to focus more and more on the deepest roots of social and political problems. And then it created a new level of quality for the Iranian cinema. And I think that to some extent, this is true also in poetry. But then, I mean, Iran has always been, it has never experienced a truly open democracy, so we cannot really know what would have been if.
Well, you can rest assured that I asked the same question, an interview with Lisa Rozovsky, who writes about Russian culture, and we had a very similar kind of non-decisive response because of the similar reasons.
I'd like to ask about the nature of repression. I mean, during the Shah, the monarchy, and later with the Islamic regime, this very radical change of regime, did it change anything about the nature of repression and therefore the nature of resistance to it as emerges from the poetry?
It's so sad. One of the only things, Iran changed obviously dramatically after the revolution. One of the things that did not change is the oppression, and not just the nature of it, but also the mechanism of oppression. One of the things that survived in its complete is the SAVAK, the secret security services that were, the same mechanism, sometimes the same people who imprisoned and tortured political objectors during the Shah's regime, continued to do so after the revolution as well. And it wasn't as, I think that today it's more dangerous for people to. By the way, some of the poets that appear in that book have been imprisoned both by the Shah and by the Islamic Republic.
So in some ways, the continuity here is the culture and the poetry.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the origins or some of the greatest influences on modern Iranian poetry. And I want to go back to the name that comes up in every discussion about this, which is in both your introduction and the introduction by Soli
Shahvar.
Right. So tell us about the father of modern Iranian poetry, Nima
Yushij.
I call him Nima. I feel like we're already close. I've read so much about
first
him.
name basis, yeah.
By the way, it's not even his real name. His real name was Ali Esfandiari.
I can't say that.
Yeah. So Nima it is. Nima Yushij is considered to be the father of modern Persian poetry, not so much because of political reasons, although there is some of that as well, but because he was the first to break the very, very strict frames of what was considered to be good and proper poetry, which is the
stylistic,
rhyming.
you
and
mean?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. And he opened it up in the structure and in the content, and therefore allowed a whole new generations of poets to express something, to turn their poetry into something much more personal, and in a very interesting dialectic process, actually from that very intimate place, to say something even more significant about society in large.
That's very interesting, because that's the feeling that I got reading the novel you translated, The Colonel, which I feel like is very, very intimate internal monologue, but so much about the state. Would you say there's an overlap there?
Oh, absolutely. And the author of The Colonel, Mahmoud Dolatabadi, who is considered to be the greatest Iranian novelist that is living today. He came from theater and he has done also some poetry. And I think that it's the essence of the greatness of Iranian good literature, exactly what Dawlatabadi is doing in that novel, to turn the very, very intimate and personal into a very blunt criticism, political criticism, which, by the way, was never published. That book was never published in Iran itself in Farsi. It was censored, keeping in mind that Dawlatabadi still lives and writes in Iran itself, makes it even more courageous.
I want to go back for a second to Nima and his stylistic changes. And those changes that he introduced and others followed, how much of a challenge was it for you as a translator? I mean, did you try to stick to those stylistic innovations? I mean, how faithful were you? How conscious were you of the stylistic element of all that?
Translating poetry in large is an incredible challenge. I mean, prose has its own challenges, translating prose, but poetry, in some ways, it made it easier, actually, because, for example, I would never dare to touch the poetry of the great classicals, such as Hafiz, Omar Khayyam, Jalaluddin Rumi, etc., because there, the structure is the essence. And if you cannot bring the structure in its wholeness into Hebrew, then you lost not just the beauty and the aesthetics, but also the essence. So,
what a tragedy! No, I mean, I really feel the sadness of inability to recreate it.
I urge everybody to go and learn Farsi just to enjoy classical poetry, because there is nothing like it. So modern poetry is easier in that sense because it doesn't sit on you as heavily, and you can actually do something with it, and you have other methods to translate the aesthetics of it into Hebrew. But there is a different technique of tuning into what... It's a very interesting process to... It's like, in the old radio...
the dial.
Yeah, the dial that you search and search and search, and at one point you say, okay, now I can hear it without the noise around. When you fall on that frequency, then you can translate it into the other language. But it actually made the work of translation easier, I think, the new form of Farsi.
Because it gave you more leeway.
Yes, definitely.
We really want to talk about some of the poems themselves. And I mean, we did read a lot of the book, but I just have a few questions about the first few by Ahmed Shamlo.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, one, for example, the first one is called Dead End in English, and it says, God must be hidden in the basement. These are strange days, my pretty one, which also gives the title of your book.
Mm-hmm.
So my first thought, of course, was very literal because I'm not a poet. I thought, which days are those? And do you think he was really referring to a particular time, or is this a metaphor for some bigger universal theme? And feel free to read if you feel like inspired to, In
Farsi.
In Farsi, I would love to. Well, Ahmad Shamlo is a good example for a poet that was persecuted both by the Shah and by the Islamic Republic. And that specific poem was written at the very early days of the revolution, after the revolution. So I think he was talking about a particular moment in time, but then it could have been easily written before the revolution as well, because he was in these cellars and he was tortured there and he was imprisoned. And they were dissecting the smiles off of the lips in the times of the Shah as well. But then, as sad of a poem as it is, I think that there is something very comforting about this repeating line. These are strange days, which implicates somehow that this is not the way of nature, that this is a deviation from the way things should be. That's the strangeness of it. And that the normal order of things is something different. I find some comfort in that.
Optimistic. Would you like to read us something? You can choose anything. I mean,
this is actually maybe not the entire thing because it's but yeah, maybe in Farsi. You mean not in?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, we hear Hebrew all the time over here.
This is Dar in Bombast. That's the name of the poem by Ahmad Shamlou. دهانت را میبویند مبادا که گفته باشی دوستت میدارم دلت را میبویند روزگار غریبی است نازنین و عشق را کنار تیرک راهبند تازیانه میزنند عشق را در پستوی خانه نهان باید کرد در این بنبست کج و پیچ سرما آتش را به سوختبار سرود و شعر فروزان می‌دارند به اندیشیدن خطر مکن روزگار غریبی است نازنین. So that's just a taste of
one of the things that always fascinates me about Iranian culture is this duality. On the one hand, as you said earlier, wearing your hat of an Iranian nationalist, it is the cradle of civilization.
Yes.
That is how it is perceived by many people in Iran. And on the other hand, there has been quite a lot of foreign meddling and influence, not just direct meddling by the great powers, but also influence. And in the introduction, Shahva says that a lot of the poetry in the early 20th century was influenced by political developments in Russia, just next door. And also, how, Iran in the turn of the 21st century, opening up to the Western world to an extent and all that. How do you think this duality crops up in the poetry that you've reviewed for this collection?
That duality, first of all, it should be said that Iran at no point was shut down to the outside world. It's not, and it has never been North Korea, for example, not even today. So there is a lot of influence in both ways, but also this has been always a way of resistance by itself. Because, for example, today, making that dialogue with Western culture, for example, is a way of resistance for younger people, the younger generations in Iran. There is a wonderful film called No One Knows of Persian Cats. And it's all about the underground young culture in Tehran today. And you listen to those bands all working underground, making wonderful hip-hop, rap, any Western form of music that you can think of, but they fill those structures with very political Iranian content. So it's not a one-way. There was at some point among the intellectuals, the prominent intellectuals in Iran in the 60s, for example, there was a fear of westernization. And I don't think it was ever about that. It was about, looking outside, enriching yourself and your tools, and then pouring very Iranian content into it.
I think that that's an interesting point, that Iran has always involved sort of a mixture of cultures, and one of the cultures that it's involved, including linguistically, is Arabic. And in one of the poems, I'm going to skip now to, you'll tell me if I'm pronouncing it completely wrong, Farrokhzad?
Farrokhzad.
I almost got it right. You have footnotes in there, which is another interesting thing. You footnote a lot of this, to help the reader understand the references. And when in one of those footnotes, you explain about the Shahnameh.
Shahnameh,
right.
Yeah.
And you explain that the Shahnameh wrote in pure Persian. Almost without Arabic.
Yeah.
So what is the intermingling of the Persian-Arabic language? And then how does it influence the culture? Because I think that's another good dimension of what you guys were just talking about.
Yeah, not only the culture, it's a huge political issue today in Iran. Huge, ever since the revolution.
Well, because Islam is essentially an Arab phenomenon.
Exactly, and with the Islam conqueror of
today, that's a difficult
Iran,
statement.
No, originally it was.
So if you take, the Iranian alphabet is the Arabic alphabet. We have 4 additional letters in Farsi that do not exist in Arabic. Basically, you can take an Arabic text and read it even without learning Arabic and pretty much understand it. I would say more than 70% of spoken Farsi today are words from Arabic roots. But ever for centuries, this has been an inner Iranian struggle with that Arab element, not just in language, but also in culture, etc. And if the Islamic Republic tried to put the Islamic identity above the Iranian one, then the backlash or the resistance to that was also made and still is made in cultural methods as well. And it's really interesting to see how contemporary poets go back writing poems using strictly pure Iranian words, the names. All of a sudden, you see new generations of kids with names from the Shahnameh, which we had never heard before when we lived in Iran. And all of a sudden, in every way that Iranians today, those who oppose the current regime, can express their loyalty to the Iranian culture as opposed to the Islamic culture, which is connotated, of course, with the Arab identity. They do it, and of course, also in literature.
And is that an indication that people who are critics of the current regime view them as somehow foreign influence?
The Arab foreign influence?
Well, I don't know. You tell me. I mean, do they see it as somehow foreign to who Iran really is?
Of course. For those people, the Iranian nationalists, especially the monarchists, the Arab conqueror of Iran, or the Islamic conqueror of Iran, was the conqueror of the barbarians of the greatest civilization on earth. And that is it explains to a great extent the hostilities that still Iranians have today towards Arabs, which is incredible. You would see levels of pure racism, really, against Arabs because of that. They never forgot that the barbarians from the Sahara Desert conquered our great civilization.
Amazing. Do you know anything? Did you get any indication of the reception of the fact that you translated it into Hebrew in Iran? From the poets themselves, those who are still alive, and maybe other people in literary circles?
And you have good close connections with some of the contemporary poets themselves.
So one of the most the prose got more. The translation of prose got more attention. They made a very big BBC piece about it in Farsi, and I was declared to be a Zionist spy by the regime because I translate critical prose.
Well, I mean, what did regular Iranians think about the fact that they could not read the Colonel because it's banned in Iran, but Israelis could read it in Hebrew?
They cannot read it officially, but they managed to get the...
With the internet? Or even before that?
No, with the internet. That made a huge... you can, send a PDF of that book to anyone. But with the poets, it was one of, I think, the most exciting moments of my life. Was last year, I went to Germany for a concert of a very, very beloved Iranian singer. And there in the audience, I all of a sudden I knew how he looked like. One of the poets here, which in my introduction, I say that he is my favorite, in Mehdi Mousavi. And he was standing there, and he knew that I translated his poetry. And I introduced myself, and there we were standing, hugging, crying. And it was so. And other poets that I've been in touch with are very, very moved by the fact that their poetry was translated into Hebrew. And one of the amazing things was that after it was published, I started receiving, I wouldn't say hundreds, but many dozens of manuscripts by Iranian poets, both from inside Iran and outside, begging me to translate their work into Hebrew.
Why?
Because it is also a way of resistance. Because of course, the poets that I choose are political in their writing, and the enemy of my enemy is my friend, sort of logic. So translating something into Hebrew and to make it available for Israeli audience, which is the greatest, enemy of the Islamic Republic, is considered to be a very radical political act in Iran today.
Was there any opposite reaction, saying, we are dissidents, we don't like the Iranian regime, but still that's no reason to suck up in inverted commas to Israel, to the Zionists or whatever?
No, I never heard of. In fact, well, of course, I couldn't be in touch directly with all the poems, but I was very concerned that I might be doing it because there's no way to ask for their permission and all of those who I were in contact with really encouraged me and told me, go ahead. Those you chose would all want you to do that.
Let's talk about one last poet who cannot speak for herself, Farrokhzad.
Mm-hmm.
What does she bring to Iranian poetry as a woman? I mean, she was considered iconoclastic. She died tragically.
Yeah. Oh, wow. She is, I mean...
we have a few minutes left, so just summarize the whole thing.
Farrokhzad is, she died before the revolution, of course, very tragically in a very young age in a car accident. But until her death, again, in a very, very young age, she made not just one revolution, she made several revolutions in
Why can't I do that?
At a young age?
At a young age, she was very outraged.
That's the only age.
But it wasn't just her poetry that was so outrageous. I mean, she wrote about sexuality, feminine sexuality in such a way that that left everybody completely shocked.
Blushing.
And she is excellent. So she did it brilliantly, but she lived very outrageously. She had a child outside the marriage. She had an open affair with who was at the time the greatest Iranian filmmaker, who, by the way, also had an affair with Dalia Rabikovich, which is
there's a lot of Dalias because in one of her poems translated into English, I noticed that she also talks about the dahlia flower. Yeah, so I feel very connected to her.
And this guy had something for women poets, I see,
and good ones too. Ibrahim Golestani, that's his name. So she is an icon, and she was also a filmmaker, a fashion icon. I mean, she had it all, and she is. Nobody compared to her afterwards, and since her death.
Can we talk about one of her poems? I was thinking of "I Pity the Garden" because I thought it was an anti-war poem.
Yeah,
is it?
Well, it's certainly definitely. I mean, when people turn their gardens into storage for ammunition, then but it's anti-war, and I think it's about the craving for something else that you cannot always articulate what it is that you're waiting for, but you know that it is not the reality that you live in, and you're waiting for something else, and that a change should appear somehow, and that it's a sick reality. Of course, it's a very political poem because the father, the mother, the brother, and the sister that she refers to in that poem all present different political sectors or sections in the then Iranian sphere. So it's definitely very, very political.
Which is a little bit like the Colonel, too, because all of the children have different...
Exactly.
Can you read us a few lines from it?
Sure. I assume you're getting me in Farsi.
We'll do the Hebrew afterward.
So that's I Pity the Garden. That's
my personal choice.
That's a wonderful, wonderful poem. دلم برای باغچه میسوزد. That's the name of the poem. کسی به فکر گلها نیست، کسی به فکر ماهی ها نیست. کسی نمیخواهد باور کند که باغچه دارد میمیرد، که قلب باغچه در زیر آفتاب ورم کرده است، که ذهن باغچه دارد آرام آرام از خاطرات سبز تهی می شود و حس باغچه آنگار چیزی می جرده است که در انزوای باغچه پوسیده است. So that's the beginning of it.
I think we have to admit that Persian is also a beautiful language.
It is. It's a language that was born for poetry. There's no doubt about it.
I don't think I have anything to add to that other than to say that everybody should read Orly Noy in Hebrew if you can, and you also have two of them translated into English. The two books we've been discussing are the poetry collection. These are Strange Times, Pretty One, and the novel The Colonel. Orly, thank you for being on the show.
Thank you very much.
And thanks to Gizem Ozdemir, our sound engineer, and to Georgia Foscarini and Itai Shelem, our producers, and to the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute for their generous support. And now a request. Many or most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcast app, and we'd like to ask you to please consider writing us a review. Just go to the ratings and review section and write us one. We like critical reviews, stellar reviews, any kind.
We prefer stellar reviews.
We kind of do. You too can support us by going to our website, tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review, and subscribing on our Patreon campaign. Check out our archive with over 500 interviews. And if you like us, you can also like us on Facebook. We're called the Tel Aviv Review Podcast, Ideas from Israel. And follow us on Twitter. Both me and Gilad are on Twitter. Find us there. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.